There we are, 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, I think we're ready. That's fine. That's fine. Good, just 1 or 2 coming in. Good. While we're waiting, could I remind you, if you would, cell phones? I think that's from the management, not from me. But thank you. Good. Well, good morning to you all. I had a sleepless night. I didn't expect anybody to be here after yesterday. I presented picture after picture of people you'd never heard of. But in defense, I will say to you, how do you paint silence and how do you paint thought? And so that's my defense. But thank you all for sticking it out. I also want to say a special thank you to those of you in the audience who've come down afterwards to talk to me and shared your thoughts with me, which gave me ideas. And that's the second reason I didn't sleep well last night, because I was up half the night reading this book, which somebody kindly gave me, which linked schizophrenia with evolution, and suddenly the whole thing came crystal clear in my mind as to what I was trying to do in this course. True. There we are. So yesterday we saw a lot of obscure people, but I think with a purpose. Today, just the opposite. Vincent van Gogh, probably the most widely known artist in the history of the world, and this particular picture, The Starry Night, probably the best known picture in the world. And we're going to see lots and lots of images of Vincent van Gogh, almost all of which will be familiar to most of you. So why are we doing this? Because I wanted to put those pictures in the chronological narrative of his life, so you know when he painted which picture and why. But more importantly, as we go through his life, we'll be looking for the peaks and troughs of his psychological roller coaster that culminated in his suicide at the age of 37, in order that we may try to arrive at a definitive diagnosis as actually what was the matter with this man. This picture here, for example, was painted 3 months after he had been admitted to the asylum just a little outside the Provence town of Saint-Rémy. The Starry Night, he had a room upstairs, which we'll look at in a moment. And there, in the early hours of the morning, with his raw canvas there, he painted what he could see in his mind's eye, or in his visual eye, because it was pretty dark, a starry sky. And the only question about the authenticity of the topography here is whether this tree was actually present or not, or whether it was a device he inserted for aesthetic purposes. He had a lifelong correspondence with his brother Theo, as you know, and we'll talk about that at some length. And he wrote to Theo from Saint-Rémy saying, "I'm struggling with all my energy to master my work, telling myself that if I win, it will be the best lightning conductor for the illness." What a beautifully coherent sentence that is. And it gives us an awareness that clearly this man was not schizophrenic, whatever else he had, because he could put words together so beautifully. And throw himself into his work he did. And in the last 2 years of his life, he produced no fewer than 800 canvases, in addition to an equal number of etchings, prints, drawings. But it was all to no avail, because shortly after leaving Saint-Rémy, within a few months, he walked into a field, took out a pistol, shot himself in the chest, and 36 hours later was dead. So what can we learn by following the life story of this young man to try to understand what was going on in his head that led to this tragic outcome? He was born in 1853 in the Dutch town of Zoetermeer, and he was the second child to be born to his father and mother. His father was the Dutch Reformed Church minister in the town. And he was the second child born, the first having been a stillbirth delivered by his mother 12 months earlier, also named Vincent. He had 3 sisters and 2 younger brothers. One was Theo, 4 years younger than Vincent, and another, less well known, Cornelius, who was the baby of the family, who went off from Holland to the Transvaal to work on the development, the building of the Transvaal Railway. But he went at a time when the Boer War was just about to break out, and he was caught up on that. And being a Dutchman, he was interned by the British on suspicion of helping the Boers, and subsequently, in an internment camp, developed a high fever and died. His grandfather was a stern man with a doctorate in theology from Leiden University. He had 6 sons, Vincent's father, a clergyman, and 3 others, all of whom were art dealers, interestingly. His mother was a deeply religious woman and homeschooled Vincent until he was 8, when he went to a boarding school, which he absolutely detested, and he was taken out at the age of 15, and there his formal education stopped. What to do? Well, he had 3 art dealer uncles at the time, and so one of his uncles suggested that this young man, who was a little bit strange, this boy, now a teenager, perhaps he would be interested in a career as an art dealer. And so an uncle who was working as an art dealer in The Hague contacted the distinguished art dealing company based in Paris. This is their headquarters building. You can see there, Goupil and Company. They were art dealers and printers. Goupil was a well-established company, a bit like Sotheby's now, with branches all over the place. And Goupil had a branch in The Hague and also a branch in London, and as far as I know, in other places as well. And so it was arranged, because his uncle was an art dealer known to the management there, that they would take this unknown young man on as an apprentice art dealer in their Hague office. But it wasn't long before young Vincent, with his difficult personality, was arguing with them, and this went on for about a year, and eventually they were on the point of dismissing him, but rather than offend his uncle and cause ripples in the art world, they arranged for his discreet transfer to their branch in London. And there he learnt English, and he stayed for the better part of a year or more as an apprentice there to the Goupil branch in Bond Street, I think it was. But then he was arguing again with them. They were telling him what to do, and he wanted none of it. He wanted to do things his own way. And again, to avoid ructions with the family, they sent him back to Paris to work in the showroom in the head office here. And there, as the customers came through the door, he was supposed to, I'm not sure, know precisely what he was supposed to do, but presumably usher them in and say bonjour or whatever, and show them and introduce them to the more senior members of the staff. But instead of doing that, he spent his time at the counter deeply immersed in the Bible. Enough was enough, and he was finally dismissed. So here was a young man now who for 3 or 4 years had been trying to become an art dealer, but things were clearly not going well. And so what to do? He wasn't sure what to do or where to go, so he enjoyed speaking English, and he enjoyed his time in London from a social point of view at least. And so he went back to England and found a job, extraordinary to relate, as a temporary teacher in the seaside town of Ramsgate. What he taught and in what language, I could not find out. But there he stayed for a couple of months before finally coming back to Paris, coming back to the Netherlands with his family. And he then resolved that instead, sorry, let me just go back one. He then contacted an uncle who was in Amsterdam, because having enjoyed the teaching, he thought he would become a preacher like his father. But in order to do that, you had to have a university degree. So he went to stay with his uncle in Amsterdam in order to do preparatory work for the entrance exam to Amsterdam University. And he beavered away and beavered away and beavered away, but it was clearly not working out, and he just couldn't cope with the academic side of it all. So he returned home. And his parents were now becoming quite worried about him. He was a late teenager. And when he was home, his behavior was like all teenagers. He would be bad-tempered and argumentative, slamming doors, going out of the house, and then disappearing into his room and locking the door. And this sort of behavior that you and I would regard as perfectly normal, but for his... But for his clergyman father, this was not normal, and he seriously suggested to Vincent that he spend 2 or 3 weeks in a psychiatric clinic in order that he could find himself and his equilibrium. And of course, that was just red rag to a bull and door slammed, and that's the last they saw of Vincent for quite a long time. He then decided, well, if I can't be a clergyman because I can't get a university degree, at least I'll be a missionary. And he was passionate about the Bible and preaching and his tunnel vision view of life. And so he went to Brussels. And there he, I presume, knocked at the door of the Brussels Missionary Society and explained himself. And they offered him an apprenticeship on a probationary period for 3 months. And they assigned him, we're not quite sure what he was assigned to, the records are not clear, but it didn't work out, and they didn't offer him at the end of the 3-month probationary period a definitive missionary post. He was undeterred, and he knew, he'd heard while working as a temporary missionary, that they did need missionaries in the southern Belgian coal mining area around the town of Wasmis. So he takes himself there, and introduces himself to the missionary society in Wasmis, and they were indeed pleased to have him. They were short. There were lots of miners and their families with their social problems, and they really needed help. So he was taken on this time for a 6-month probationary period in Wasmis, tending to the emotional and spiritual needs of the families of the coal miners and the miners themselves. And at the end of 6 months, his evaluations came in from his peers and his superiors at the missionary society, and sadly, it wasn't what was hoped for. They described him as slovenly in dress, a difficult, irascible personality with poor communication skills. And with that rather damning, sad report, of course, that was the end of his missionary career. So he now goes back. He had written to Theo, in whom he was now in contact. Theo was now working as an art dealer in Paris, his younger brother, and he wrote to Theo for advice what he should be doing, and told him the situation. And Theo contacted his parents back in the Netherlands to say that things were not going well for Vincent. He couldn't really hold down any job at all. Whereupon Vincent's father makes an appointment for a distinguished professor of psychiatry in The Hague for Vincent and plans to accompany him there. And they go to The Hague, but Vincent refuses to go in and see the professor, and the whole thing is just cancelled, and that's that. So clearly there were worrying signs very early on in his life. Vincent stays in Belgium, and then quite unexpectedly turns up at home, unannounced, to discover there was his recently widowed cousin, Key, and her young son. He remembered her, but he hadn't seen much of her. And he sees her, and staying with his parents, they go out for a walk together. And as they're walking together, re-establishing contact, cousin to cousin, he suddenly turns round to her and says, "Will you marry me?" And she, thinking it was a sort of joke, backed off and said, "Well, Vincent, I don't think that'll work out. I'm 7 years older. I've got a son of 6 here. I don't think that's going to work out at all." And he was crestfallen by that. He then wrote to Vincent again, saying, I'm studying hard, he said, on finding a career. Can you give me some advice? And Theo wrote back to Vincent saying, "I remember well, you were good at drawing as a child. Why don't you do some drawings? It'll do you good anyway. Send me what you're drawing, and I'll comment on it and tell you what I think," which he did. And this is one of the earliest drawings that Vincent van Gogh did. It's of his next-door neighbour. And it's interesting he chose his melancholic next-door neighbour as a subject, because this meshed, I think, very well with his own mood at the time, one would suspect. Right at the bottom there, it says in Dutch, "Eternity's Gate," at Eternity's Gate. Whether he put that on, I don't know. The handwriting is different. It was probably put on by a dealer, and dealers have to market things. And if you market something, it needs a title, and it needs to attract attention. So that's what that piece is particularly called. But just look at it. What an accomplished drawing it was. And he sent it to Theo, and Theo was very impressed. And he said, "Send me more. It's good work. Send me more." And so Vincent goes off and buys a palette of watercolours and does this. a scene, and with his dark mood, it's not surprising, it's a winter scene, dark clouds, a path that looks as though it's been raining, a tree that looks 3/4 dead, but look carefully, and the tree is not completely dead. There are little tiny buds appearing on the twigs there. And if you look at the sky, a couple of patches of blue. So Vincent, for the first time, was beginning to feel optimistic about a career as an artist. And he sends this to Theo, who is impressed. And in return, Theo sends him now a box of travelling oil paints so that he can go out in the countryside and paint just like the Impressionists. Vincent likes the oil paints, but he doesn't go outside. He stays inside and does still lifes. And here's one of his early still life, a cabbage, you can see, some potatoes, a carrot, and a pair of clogs. But dark, dark colours. And he sends this, let me just go back one, he sends this together with some other still lives, all in this very dark tone, not to Theo, but to one of his uncles who's an established art dealer. Theo is just learning the trade in Paris. And his uncle looks at these and says, well, he'll put them in his gallery, but I don't think they're going to sell because they look too dull. And indeed they didn't. And so Vincent became a bit despondent about that. He then decides, whenever he's at a low, he keeps changing where he lives. And so now he goes off to The Hague. And in The Hague, he goes to a brothel, and there he meets Sien Horlick. Sien is one of the pros of the field there, and she is quite heavily pregnant. And in spite of that, they hit it off well, and she actually moves in with him in his accommodation in The Hague. Vincent always writing to Theo lets the family back home know what's going on, and his father is so horrified at what's happening to his Bible-loving son that he serves papers in the local court to have Vincent made a ward of court. Sien, meanwhile, gives birth to her son, and shortly afterwards, mother and child leaving Vincent alone, and the papers are then withdrawn as the immediate crisis seems to be over. And all that Sien has left him with is a severe case of gonorrhea, for which he is admitted to hospital for 3 weeks, where he has painful urethral alum irrigations. And that will be a recurring problem. Coming out of hospital, he does another still life, and here it is, a painting of remorse, I suspect, for what has happened, an open Bible and a pair of candles. He's now feeling more confident in himself, in his ability as a painter for the first time, as he's looking for more interesting subjects than candles, Bibles, clogs, and onions. And so he goes here and he approaches a weaver, and he does 4 or 5 canvases of the weaver. Here's one of the more striking ones with colour, as you can see there. And you can see his style that he's developing, quite physical in its nature, and really quite an advance from the still life that we saw a little earlier. And he's quite pleased with that. And then he paints, again, an interior, dark, here of some women enjoying a meal of potatoes, one serving some tea there or coffee around a table, and the meal consists of potatoes. And he sends this to his dealer uncle as well. And his uncle says, good work, getting better by the day, but still too dark, and they don't sell. And just about this time, he learns that his father has died. So every time there's an emotional crisis, he changes location, and now he leaves there and travels to, what is the port? Antwerp, little block. Goes to Antwerp, the port, and paints, and as luck would have it, it's a rainy day, as it often is in Antwerp. The sky is heavy, and there are the boats there. And meanwhile, Theo is sending him money to pay for his lodging and also pay for his food. But Vincent, now bitten by the painting bug, is spending most of his money on his paints and on his canvases and on his beloved tobacco for his pipe, but not on food. And now, 30 years old, his teeth are beginning to fall out, one by one. Whilst in Antwerp, he takes advantage of the city and the cultural treasures that are to be found there by going into the churches, and there he comes across for the first time some of the great works of the Renaissance. And here is Rubens' picture of the Education of Mary. And for the first time, he's seeing oil painting with vivid colour. He's particularly taken by the silver blue of her dress there, the scarlet, and the pink of the chubby cherubs and the flowers above. And this gives him ideas that I need to get on out of this. They keep telling me my paintings are too dark. Perhaps this is what I should be doing. And then he goes round the various galleries and he sees what is fashionable at the time throughout Europe, the Japanese woodblock prints that are still popular today. And he sees those and he picks up on the aesthetic of this. Simplified forms, blocks of colour, very simple. And he's very, very enthusiastic. And he goes from lows to highs, and he writes to Theo to saying, I think this is going to work out. Can I come to Paris to be with you? Because Paris was still the Mecca for artists, and there was a lot going on, and he's been stimulated by what he's seen in relatively provincial Antwerp. What would only be waiting for him in Paris? So in great excitement, he writes to Theo and say, can I join you in Paris? And Theo, being a good, loyal younger brother, says, yes, of course, and he comes. Theo lived at the bottom of the hill of Montmartre, a leafy little village at the time, and Vincent goes to the top of the village because he heard there that there's an old windmill, which reminds him of home, which is attached to some derelict buildings which are now being incorporated together as a working man's dance hall. And the proprietor of the working man's dance hall lures the customers in by giving them, with their glasses of wine and beer, little galette cakes that she makes as a sort of little speciality of the house, as it were. And so this dance hall became known as the Moulin De La Galette at the top of the hill. And here Vincent does one of his very few paintings he does while he's actually in Paris. And here he paints the Moulin de la Galette at the top of Montmartre Hill. But it isn't long before Vincent again rubs people up the wrong way, and even his beloved brother, who has been supporting him all this time, has had enough. They're arguing, and Theo then writes to their sister Wilhelmina to say what's going on. He writes, there was a time I loved Vincent very much, and he was my best friend, but that's over now. He loses no opportunity to let me know he despises me. No one wants to come by anymore because it always leads to rows, and he's so filthy and slovenly that the house looks anything but inviting. These are huge clues as to what's going on in his head, I think, and we'll try to bring these together a little later on. In spite of that letter, Theo, the loyal younger brother, secures a place in Cormon's celebrated private art academy in Paris, which all young students flock to try to go to. Fernand Cormon is there, painting with his palette, as you can see. And look who's sitting on a chair right in the bottom left-hand corner there, none other than Toulouse-Lautrec, who was also a student. And so the two of them meet. Lautrec was absolutely fascinated by Vincent, firstly because he was quite a bit older than the other students. He was now in his early 30s, and the others were usually in their 20s or so. But particularly, and he found him so fascinating that Toulouse-Lautrec did this pastel sketch of Vincent. You can see looking quite a bit older than his 33 years or whatever he was just then. And what fascinated Lautrec about his personality was his piercing eyes and the fact that he had wooden false teeth that clattered whenever he spoke in bad French. But he was a loner, Vincent, insofar as he would talk with the other students at the end of the teaching session that Cormon was giving, and when they would meet afterwards, they would chat and discuss art theory and what they were doing. But Vincent would have none of their opinions whatever. He told them what he should be doing, he told them what they should be doing, and if they disagreed with them, he just dismissed them out of hand. So this rigid, it sort of recalls Michelangelo in a way, doesn't it? It's all very interesting as we put this together. The students, though, were kind enough to introduce him to Monsieur Tanguy, who ran a shop not far from Fernand Cormon's studio, school, where the young students could buy their art supplies. And here we see one of the first portraits that Vincent did of Monsieur Tanguy, who was such a nice man that he forgave the students who came asking for their supplies. He gave them supplies even if they didn't have any money. And so the tabs grew longer and longer and longer, and they gave him the honorific of Père Tanguy as a means of thanking him for the credit that he was granting them. And so that's where this picture comes from. And there is Père Tanguy, the art dealer, sitting in front of his woodblock prints that he also had for sale in his shop. While in Paris, of course, he has had an opportunity to go around various galleries to see what else was going on, and that, of course, was the high point of the Impressionist craze. All the galleries were full of Impressionist painting, but what attracted him particularly was this pointillistic technique that seemed to fascinate Vincent more than the more vigorous brush strokes. And so he does a self-portrait, again, one of the few paintings he did in Paris, and here you can see he's adopted that pointillist technique there in this self-portrait as an experiment. He also stumbles across a gallery where there's some exotic-looking oil paintings. And these exotic oil paintings are a one-man exhibition being given by a gallery owner for one Paul Gauguin, who had just returned from Martinique, carrying these pictures with him. And Vincent had heard of Gauguin and held him very much in awe, and actually met him in the gallery very, very briefly and sort of rather deferringly sort of just acknowledged who he was and thanked him and saying how much he enjoyed his pictures. And that was that. But Gauguin himself was a very difficult personality, and the two individuals were night and day in terms of their personalities. Gauguin was arrogant, self-opinionated, dismissive of others, whereas Van Gogh, although showing those traits outwardly, inwardly was nervous to the point of being neurotic. Vincent was feeling the pressure of urban Paris. It was bustling, 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 and Montmartre was supposed to be a little green village comparative to the rest of the town. But this is a contemporary postcard from around the time, 1890 or thereabouts, of the Carrefour des Boulevards Montmartre et des Italiens. So a junction in Montmartre, bustling, as you can see. The horses and carriages and the horse-drawn buses are now having to vie with motor-drawn omnibuses. And all this was much too much for Vincent. He found the whole thing claustrophobic, closing in. He enjoyed his experience at the Cormont School, but somehow it wasn't coming together. He was doing hardly any painting. And he really felt that he needed to get out of Paris. It was becoming claustrophobic. And he said to Theo that he felt he really needed to go down to the south of France. And what precipitated that decision was yet another recurrence of his gonorrhea, which brought him into hospital for more painful irrigations. And he thought the kinder weather in the south of France would do something for his gonorrhea. And so then, after 2 years in Paris, he does head south and chooses the town of Arles as a place to go. And as soon as he arrived, suddenly everything lights up for him. All the colours that he'd thought about, there they were. Even with the setting sun, the golden wheat field there, you can see, is absolutely glowing, and his palette now adopts this vigorous, bright, vibrant light with the yellows, the golds, and the blues there. And he writes to Theo full of enthusiasm, saying that he loves it here and he really feels he can do good work. He lodges at the Café de la Gare in Arles when he arrives, looking for a studio. And he goes around the town looking for where he can do his work, and he comes across this double house here. You can see one with pink blind hanging over the pavement there, and the other half of the house has green shutters and a green door, just on the Place Lamartine in Arles. The house is still there. And it's the house with the green shutters that was actually available for rent, upstairs and downstairs. And with the money that Theo is sending him, he puts down a deposit and takes the house on the right-hand side there, the green shutter house, and this is going to be his studio. And he has grandiose ideas for this studio. And the grandiose thing is something that's been a theme for the last week, as you know. He's going to call this studio not a studio of the South, but the studio of the South. And he envisions it as a mecca for artists to come and show their work, and where he can show his work to other artists and to dealers. So he's very elated and very excited and sets to work producing a body of work, because he'd done next to nothing in Paris that was going to be saleable at least. And so he sets to work. And what does he set to work doing? He starts off with 4 canvases, square canvases of sunflowers. They're all different insofar as the sunflowers are, some vases have 12 in, some have 10 in. The colours are slightly different. The band of colour above the beige of the vase is different. The background is different, and different museums around the world have their own version of sunflowers. But this is the one that happens to be in the National Gallery in London, for what that's worth. And Vincent's concept was that he would frame them all the same. They'd all be the same size, all be square, and that he would line the walls of his gallery with his creations in the gallery of the South. Starting off with still lifes, but there will be city view, there will be town views, there will be landscapes, and there will be portraits. Grandiose vision for what he's going to achieve in his studio. And he goes out, and there's the cafe at night. And you can see the stars there in the sky beginning to develop a little halo, but that's just an incidental observation at this stage. And you can see the vivid colours, the yellows, the greens, the beige, and the light. And he's obviously very excited and on a high, and things are going well. But then he writes to Theo to say that something's happened. He says, "Things were going so well, Theo, but I'm unable to describe exactly what is the matter with me. Now and then, the horrible fits of anxiety, apparently without cause, or otherwise a feeling of emptiness and fatigue in the head. At times I have attacks of melancholy and atrocious remorse." And he goes on in the letter to say, at bottom, I'm really feeling lonely. I remember meeting Gauguin in Paris, the great Gauguin, who had a reputation now for being a true original, and perhaps he could learn from Gauguin if Theo could persuade Gauguin to join him for a short time in Arles. And there's Theo, and Theo obliges, and he approaches Gauguin and says, "My brother Theo, he met you briefly," and Gauguin scratches his head and I'm sure can't remember who he was. But he does eventually persist and persist, and Gauguin finally relents and thinks, well, perhaps it wouldn't be a bad idea to go down to the south of France, free accommodation, why not? And he says, all right, well, I'll come down and I'll spend a few weeks with your brother. Tell him I'm coming at the end of October. And so he does. And Theo tells Vincent that Gauguin has agreed to spend some time in Arles with him, and Vincent is over the moon. He goes off and buys some furniture, because all this time he's living in the Café de la Gare, in a room by the railway station, using the yellow house there just as a studio. The upstairs has been empty. So now he goes out and he buys 2 beds, simple beds, a couple of tables, a couple of chairs, a few pictures on the wall that he's done, and there we are. He painted the room ready to receive Gauguin. And I'm not sure if this is Vincent's room or Gauguin's room next door, but I'm sure they were very similar. And so Gauguin finally arrives, and they start painting together. And Gauguin does very little work when he's there. He's there for about 6 or 7 weeks. He does very little painting, but he does this painting of Vincent at his easel in his chair with his coat. So it was latter part of the year, and even in Arles in November, the weather gets a bit cold, and there's Vincent in his coat painting. And they immediately, within days of meeting, Vincent is in awe and trembling at the thought of this great man coming to spend time with him, but soon his personality comes out and he starts arguing with Gauguin. Personalities couldn't be more different, and they clash constantly as personalities, but more than just as personalities, on a matter of artistic principle. For Gauguin, painting was all about imagination. For Vincent, he says, no, you have to paint what you see. And there you can see Vincent painting his sunflowers there with the vase. There's the canvas. We can't see what's on the canvas. We just have a side view, but there's the bowl of flowers that he's actually painting. And the two clash. And Gauguin says, well, you asked me down here to tell you what to do. Forget copying things. Use your imagination, man. Paint for me a picture of your native Holland. You'll remember that, surely. And Gauguin nervously, Vincent nervously agrees. And this is what he produces. Strange painting. Green, houses of his native flat Holland, bushes, clouds, all in this strange acidic green. Clearly he's very uncomfortable with what Gauguin has recommended. And then everybody around the world knows what happened next. Vincent's ear. What happened? But more interesting, why? Well, we know what happened because there was an account written in the weekly Arles newspaper called the Republican Forum. And the reporter writes as follows. Last Sunday, the 23rd of December, 1888, at 11:30 p.m., one Vincent van Gogh, a painter and native of Holland, presented himself at the brothel Maison de Tolérance numéro 1 and asked for Rachel and handed her, wrapped in paper, his ear, saying, "Keep this carefully so you will remember me." The article goes on, the police were called and the following morning found him lying in bed, showing hardly any signs of life. He was taken to the local hospital. Gauguin tells us what happened. They were working together and, as always, arguing about something or other, and Gauguin became alarmed because Vincent was now threatening Gauguin with violence, which he had never done before. Alarmed, Gauguin decides to sleep that night in a hotel. And when he returns to the Yellow House the next morning, he finds the door open and the police there. And he goes inside and he finds the whole place splattered with blood. And he asked the police what had happened. They said, this man here is in the hospital. There's been an accident of some sort. And Gauguin goes off to the post office to send a telegram to Theo in Paris to tell him his brother's in hospital and that he should come down. When Gauguin gets back to the house, it seems as though the whole of Arles has gathered outside, gawking at what's going on in there. Gauguin later related to a friend what he thought precipitated Vincent slicing off his ear. And what it was that Gauguin had told Vincent, frankly, I've had enough of you and I'm going back to Paris tomorrow. And that's what provoked, I think, the outburst of threat against Gauguin and the whole episode. So there is what happened and probably why. Theo gets the telegram and he takes the night train from Paris to Arles and is met at the station by Gauguin, who the next morning takes him to the Arles hospital and the ward where Vincent is a patient. Vincent later painted this from memory of the ward in which he was admitted at the time, just prior to his discharge. His memory was sufficiently sharp for him to recall the detail. Tellingly, Gauguin stays outside and doesn't go to see Vincent in the ward at all. Theo goes in and sees the situation and talks to his admitting physician, Dr. Felix Ray, who subsequently befriended Vincent and agreed to sit for his portrait, which he did here. And Felix Ray, interestingly, on his admitting diagnosis as the physician of the day when Gauguin came in, he wrote on the admission diagnosis, acute mania and generalized delirium. Well, it's not a diagnosis so much just a descriptor of his symptoms, because psychiatry in 1890 or so was not really very advanced. But Ray said to Theo he will keep an eye and send reports, and as it was Christmas Eve, Theo and Gauguin took the train back to Paris. And Felix Ray, the physician, was going to be the go-between, and he would report back what was going on to Theo. And what he reported was that for the next couple of days, your brother was behaving in a very strange way. He was getting in and out of bed with other patients, and on one occasion was found washing himself in the coal bucket. But slowly, he seemed to improve, and plans were eventually made after 3 weeks of hospitalization for him to return to the Yellow House. The physician in charge wrote in his discharge note that a psychiatric opinion is suggested. While preparations were made for Vincent to return to the Yellow House, now he seemed to be managing all right, a cleaning lady was sent to mop up all the blood, and the house was then made ready. In addition to the cleaning lady, the postman, Joseph Rollin, whose portrait Vincent subsequently painted, also went to the house to help with the cleaning, and he met Theo before Theo returned to Paris, saying that when your brother is discharged from hospital, I will pop by from time to time, keep an eye on Vincent for you, and I'll report to you if there's anything to tell. So that was the relationship there. So Vincent goes back home, and now he tries to re-find his equilibrium. And how does he do that? Well, he needs to throw himself into work for sure, but what does he choose to paint? He does a still life, selecting items from his previous life which to him represented normality and stability. So he puts a board on his table, and on the table he puts a plate, some onions, things familiar, his beloved pipe and tobacco. At the back there a candle and some matches you can see in a pot, a coffee pot behind, and there to remind him of his brother Theo, a letter from Theo. And interestingly, a book on health, santé, there, indicating that he was clearly trying to come to grips with the nature of his illness. He does some self-portraits, here with his ear bandaged. And he'd started, before Gauguin left and before the ear incident, started painting two chairs, almost sort of anthropomorphic chairs, one Vincent, one Gauguin. And he'd only started work on his own chair, and now feeling a bit more in command of himself and the situation, he completes the painting of his own chair, trying to re-establish equilibrium and normality. Whoops, what's happened here? There we are. He writes to Theo saying things are going well, but not for long. He's now readmitted to the hospital, this time with hallucinations, and the voices are telling him that he's being poisoned. And this is a painting he subsequently did of the courtyard of the hospital. And he's admitted for 2 weeks this time, eventually seems to get better, and then returns home. Back home, he's visited by the wife of Joseph Rollin, the postman. Her name is Augustine, and she's a lovely maternal figure, and she pops in to see him because he's on his own and asks him how he is and how things are going. And Vincent really adores her, and he regards her like a sort of mother figure, exaggerating her bosoms, I suspect, to convey the motherly instinct. And there he paints her, with her permission, this portrait. And interestingly, he calls it, on the right-hand side there in right, you can just see La Berceuse, the lullaby, as if he's imagining himself a baby on her lap being rocked. I think quite a moving picture. But the final straw comes not only with another relapse of his gonorrhea while he's down in Arles, yet another admission to Arles Hospital, back home again, and every time he comes back home, the local people come peering in to see this strange monster man, and he shouts at them and throws things at them, to the point that the local citizenry petition the mayor to have him incarcerated in a mental institution. The mayor's not quite sure what to do legally. Has he got the right to do that, and medical advice and one thing and another? But before we know it, Vincent himself realizes this can't go on. And so what the precipitating episode was the people peering through his door, through his window every morning. He would wake up, go downstairs, and there he would find a dozen faces peering at him, everyone trying to, like a circus performer, trying to see the monster. And Vincent says, enough is enough. And so he approaches his Protestant clergyman, who agrees to drive him to the abbey, former abbey of Saint-Paul de Moselle, a little way 30 kilometers outside Saint-Rémy, which had been converted into a mental asylum. And there Vincent is admitted, and what is interesting was to see the admitting note written by the director of the institution, Dr. Perron. And Dr. Perron writes that Vincent van Gogh gave a very clear account of himself and his symptoms. I was very impressed, he writes, and he writes as the admitting diagnosis, epilepsy. Where that came from, I can't imagine. Whether it was just the episodic nature of Vincent's mental illness, which is characteristic of epilepsy, led him to that, I don't know. So there is the institution as it now is, and it's still a hospital, although no longer a mental hospital. And there's the abbey, and Vincent was given a room upstairs, and it was from one of these upstairs rooms that he painted the Starry Night. He was given a second room downstairs as a studio. And at the time, there wasn't the field of lavender there, but it was an unkempt, large unkempt garden that surrounded the abbey, and beyond that were wheat fields. After a month of settling in, he seemed to be fine, no relapses at all. He went out and was given permission to go out for the day to paint, and here he paints an olive grove with the hills of the Alpil behind there, you can see. But again, rather disturbed brushwork, as I think you would acknowledge, and look at that curious cloud hovering above there. But this was his perception, and he seemed to be fine, and he wrote to Theo saying he was really feeling good and he was beginning to paint again, and the people there, the nuns, were kind and the food was reasonable, and all seemed to be going well. And here's, just to recall the correspondence between these two brothers, Vincent wrote no fewer than 4,000 letters which have survived to his brother Theo. And you can see, as we looked at Wölfli's writing and the other writings of schizophrenics and everything else, there's nothing really comparable in the style of writing there. It seems just a normal sort of handwriting with crossings out where he makes corrections in order that the text should read more coherently. So clearly not schizophrenia. And he frequently illustrated the letters, and this is a letter at the time he was doing the Potato Eaters. And he writes to Theo to say all is going well, but then suddenly another relapse again. And what happened now is that one of the nuns discovered that what Vincent was doing was eating the paint from his oil tubes. And so he was confined to barracks, as it were, for a while, whilst the doctor tried to sort that out. And then he seemed to perk up, and now he went out, and here we have a picture of a lilac bush in flower, can you see? And it all looks really rather pleasant, doesn't it? So you can see how his mood fluctuates from one to the other. Nothing turbulent about that at all. But then something else happens, and as he feels yet another one of these episodes coming on, he has a couple of days' warning, like a prodrome. He paints this scene. It happens to be where there's a quarry, a disused quarry. You can just make out a little area there. And that paints, and again, back is this disturbed brushwork all the time. A year has gone by in the institution now, and Vincent is really feeling that he needs to change the scenery. And what is getting him down is not the care he's received, but the presence of all the other mental patients in the institution, which remind him constantly of his own problem. And even some of the nuns are getting on his nerves. So he writes to Theo saying, I really feel I would be better if I came back to the north again. And Theo says, well, are you really sure about that? And Vincent says, well, could I not be under the care of your own doctor? And so Theo approaches his own doctor, who is Dr. Gachet, who lives in a little town, pretty little town in the country, popular with artists because of the scenery. And Dr. Gachet lives in this little town called Auvers-sur-Oise, not far from Paris. And Gachet agrees to take him on as a patient, as it were, and arrangements are made for Vincent to go. Dr. Peyron, the director of the asylum, gives Vincent a discharge letter to give to Dr. Gachet when he sees him. And in his discharge letter he writes, this patient is calm most of the time, but several crises lasting 2 weeks to a month when he has terrifying fears, attempted to kill himself by swallowing paint and paraffin from the boy lighting the lamp. Discharged today for the north of France, hoping the climate will suit him better. Dr. Gachet here, sketched by Vincent subsequently, had earned his doctorate in melancholia, or what we would now call depression. And hearing Theo's description of his brother's ailments, he said to Theo, "Oh, I'll take him on, don't worry. It doesn't sound as though there's very much wrong with this young man other than good food and some exercise and fresh air won't cure. He should stop worrying about himself," was Dr. Gachet's diagnosis. Theo goes, Vincent leaves the south and he travels up to Paris, and on his way to Auvers-sur-Oise, he stops by the apartment where his brother Theo lives. Let me just go back. He goes to his apartment where his brother lives and stays for a few days, and to his dismay he discovers, and I think he probably knew, but the reality was hitting home, that Theo was now married and had a young son who he affectionately called after his wayward brother Vincent. But what was worrying Vincent now, the big Vincent, was that now brother was married and he was depending on him for his finance and moral and spiritual support, that now he was married with a son, Theo would no longer have time for him. So with those thoughts in mind, he then takes up lodging above the bar restaurant run by Monsieur and Madame Ravoux in Auvers-sur-Oise. And there he throws himself to work, feeling depressed and alone, but throws himself into work. He has a room above there where he lives, and in 70 days he produces 70 canvases of oil. He goes out into the town and then paints the church in Auvers-sur-Oise. A little bit wonky, as you can see there, the sky looking a little bit turbulent, but again, the vivid blue and the rather acid green there, I think. And he paints that. And then he paints Dr. Gachet. He visits Dr. Gachet, and for the first few weeks things go well. He goes every week for a consultation, and they chat about anything and everything, and Gachet agrees to have his portrait painted. And so Vincent paints this portrait of Dr. Gachet. But within the month, they stop seeing each other. Why? Because they're arguing again, and he won't do what Gachet says. And so now Vincent is on his own. Before he left Arles, he did some paintings of wheat fields. This is in the spring before he left. And you can see there are already gathering storm clouds. And now he's in Auvers. He paints the wheat field now in full fruit, golden wheat field. But look at the sky, now heavy with clouds, and landing on the wheat field a flock of black crows, the harbingers of death. On a Sunday afternoon, Vincent goes down from his lodging in the Ravoux place, goes down to where the chateau is, and then walks into a cornfield behind the chateau. And he takes out a revolver, and he points at his chest and fires, and falls to the ground unconscious. Surprisingly, some hours later, he regains consciousness and is actually able to get up and stagger back to his lodgings in the Ravoux cafe, and takes himself up to bed. Monsieur Ravoux sees the situation, immediately calls a doctor who examines him when he's in bed, recognizes the wound and says, "The bullet is much too deep, there is nothing I can do." And that was the state of the art in 1890. Monsieur Ravoux calls Theo, who comes and sits vigil by his bedside, and 36 hours later, Vincent dies. The funeral was a sad affair. It was attended only by Vincent, by Theo, Dr. Gachet, 20 local people whom he hardly knew, and a couple of artists. 6 months later, his own brother Theo died. He had been ill, died back in the Netherlands, only 33 years of age. Why? Probably tuberculosis, possibly syphilis, more likely tuberculosis, and died. And he was buried in a family plot in Utrecht. In 1914, his widow had him exhumed in order to be reburied next to his brother in the churchyard at Arles, which Vincent had actually painted 3 months before his death. The ghost of Vincent can still be found. If you go to Arles, you can go to the hospital where he was confined, and you can walk there and around, and that's you remember the cloisters that he painted when he was admitted with the hallucinations and claims that he was being poisoned. The ghost of Vincent still strides boldly around the hospital in Arles. In 1960, a farmer back in Auvers-sur-Oise was ploughing a field and came across a metal object that struck his plough, and he looked down and it looked like a rusty old gun. It had lost the wood of the stock, but the rest of it was intact. And he just took it to somebody who knew a bit about guns, and it was identified as Le Fanchot civilian version of a revolver manufactured between 1865 and 1890. Adeline Ravoux, the daughter of the landlord, recalls that her father had such a pistol. And it seems very likely that was the very gun that Vincent had shot himself with, which had fallen down when he lost consciousness and now recovered. So what was the diagnosis of this man? Well, the bottom line is we don't know, but we've got so many clues, haven't we? I think we can, let's look first of all at things that were just a reflection of his bizarre lifestyle. Could all his hallucinations and behavioral problems be on the basis of alcoholism? The answer is yes, except that he wasn't an alcoholic in the way that we saw Edvard Munch was, for example. He'd only started drinking a year or two before the end came. So it's unlikely simply on the basis of the time scale. Tertiary syphilis, well, there was no evidence he had syphilis, but bear in mind the syphilitic spirochete is often a fellow traveller with a bacterium causing gonorrhea. So he may have acquired syphilis without anybody ever realising it. And in any event, there was no effective treatment anyway. So that remains a possibility that this was the tertiary stage of syphilis affecting the brain and his behaviour. Equally plausible is the possibility that he had porphyria, the illness that afflicted King George III, the madness of King George III, episodic outbursts with all the symptoms that he experienced. Although plausible medically, it seems implausible by the fact that in porphyria, during an acute attack, the urine turns into a characteristic plum colour. And in 1890, or the 1880s thereabouts, one of the few things a doctor could do, apart from taking the pulse, was examine the urine. In fact, in the 18th century, doctors were derisively called piss prophets. And it seems to me inconceivable that with his many admissions to hospital, his urine would not have been examined and that diagnosis would have been made. So I think we have to rule that out. And then there's lead poisoning. All artists use lead white as the purest, most brilliant form of lead or white oil paint. And artists tend to lick their brushes or not wash their hands properly. But the brain is susceptible in infancy and in the fetus, but not so much in old age or in middle age. So that seems a less likely diagnosis. What about an intrinsic underlying abnormality? Well, there's no question he had a personality disorder. He was also manic in his activity, of bursts of activity, 70 paintings in 70 days in Auvers-sur-Oise, and also fits of depression, which he admitted himself, as well as episodes of anxiety, which he recorded in his letters to Theo. So that, I think, is a must. He must have that in the diagnosis. Temporal lobe epilepsy is a little bit nebulous. It's a little bit of a dustbin, and what it postulates is that the temporal lobe of the brain, where auditory sensations are interpreted, remember we looked on Wednesday at the brain with the part of the brain that receives the auditory stimuli of sound, and a different part of the brain allows you to formulate the words to answer and carry out a conversation. And it's postulated in this particular condition, spontaneous epileptic-like bursts of activity occur in the temporal lobe, producing these hallucinations and other sort of cognitive defects. Schizophrenia, I think we had to rule that out because of the lucidity with which he writes. So that's as far as we can get with the diagnosis. So let's just in the last few minutes, I short-changed you yesterday and I'm going to long-change you today, so just about 5 or 10 minutes if you're patient. How do we link all this together? We started out by calling this course the link between art, genius, art and madness. We've had enough art, I think, to last us a week or two. But what about the genius and madness? How can we establish that these things are definitely linked? Aristotle had no doubt at all. He said no great genius was without a measure of insanity. and Shakespeare concurred in many of his characters in his plays. A genius, in order to answer something scientifically, you have to be able to define what it is you're studying. And if we're trying to make a statement about the relationship between genius on one hand and madness on the other, we have to define genius and we have to define madness. And then we have to identify individuals who have those qualities.